So this is going to be the last episode on the Hadith preservation series. And in this presentation, I'm going to be going over the tangible manuscripts and evidences that we have to corroborate with the Hadith tradition and the Hadith corpus, and attempts to kind of show the reliability of the Hadith. And so these tangible sources will include the manuscript tradition of the earliest Qur'anic manuscripts that we possess, as well as archaeological inscriptions and just early sources that corroborate narrations found within the Hadith sources. So, for the sake of clarity, we'll be touching on what Hadith are once again, and we're also going to be going over the Uthmanic recension and the Hadith reliability. We'll be taking a look at the companion Mushaf readings and how there are different variations that are preserved within the Hadith corpus, and how, again, they corroborate with material evidence. And then we'll be taking a look at the archaeological evidence and the significance of that in terms of Hadith reliability. We'll follow up with a view on the solar eclipse and Hadith accuracy, and that's going to be somewhat of an interesting point because the Hadith have explicitly two instances where they report a solar eclipse. You can look at the astrological projection calculations of NASA and see how those dates line up with the dates mentioned within the Hadith corpus. So once again, goes to show the reliability of the Hadith sources. We'll go over the oral tradition in Arabia and how it's quite robust, contrary to what some may think. And then we'll be looking over the Isnad system, and then just to conclude the overall presentation. So I've already mentioned this in the last few episodes, but what is a hadith, right? What's the definition of a hadith? Hadith are reports or sayings of the Prophet that include not just his verbal declarations, but also his physical actions, as well as the approvals by the companions. And in general, hadith are used not just for sake of historicity, but also in terms of formulating the Sharia or the Islamic law, as well as just theology in general for our creeds. And what we can kind of show is that if these hadith are reliable, then they have a basis to be said historically and to be believed in through a kind of traditional lens. And the preservation of these hadith include methods such as memorization, as well as written documentation, and their verification is done through the Isnad system. Now, I've also elaborated a bit on the kind of the pushback by the Orientalists, including Galzer and as well as Joseph Scott. And I've shown that they've wholesome dismissed the entire hadith corpus as fictitious. And one of the things that they've juxtaposed the hadith with is what's known as the telephone game. So if some of you guys haven't played it before, it's essentially you have someone who whispers something in the ear of someone nearby, and then that individual goes and whispers it to another individual nearby, and then that individual goes and whispers it once again, and does this for a number of times and makes a chain. And then what you can do is you go to the last person in the chain, and you go to the first person, and you compare what the message was, and you can see where the distortions are happening. So you can see, for example, the last person might have said something completely different than the person prior to him. And so a lot of these Oriental scholars, they've leveled this kind of hadith preservation system as if it was just this game of telephone. Now, in response to that accusation, what a lot of the Muslim scholars have said in return is that comparing it to something like the telephone game is quite flawed because the hadith preservation system, first of all, it didn't just rely on oral reports. There also are extensive written documents or written mushafs from within the first century of Islam that preserve the writings of certain, and a good source here is Sheikh. He's a modern day scholar, and he's documented over 15 companions during the time of the Prophet himself that were writing hadith. And on top of that, it's also not a fair comparison because a system has kind of rigorous application of scrutiny as well as narrative evaluation. So it's not blindly accepting a report from just anyone. They also look at corroboration and stuff like that. But again, that all goes to show that the comparison is completely false. Now, with regards to the first bit of evidence, we'll be looking at the Uthmanic recension and how that kind of ties into Hadith preservation. Hadith, where they describe a specific instance where Uthman, who became the Khalifa at 650 CE, what he does is he orders a standardization process of the Quran. And we'll see this in a bit more detail later on, but some of the Quranic variants, so some of the companions were reciting verses of the Quran in different dialects. And so that kind of became confusing once Islam started to spread. What Uthman did was he essentially standardized the text of the Quran into one recitation form, and this is exclusively detailed within the Hadith corpus. And so what this goes to show is that we have these tangible manuscripts from the first century, and we can compare those manuscripts with what the hadith are saying about the Qur'anic recension project. And we can see that when there is similarity, that goes to show that there's great corroboration between the hadith and the textual basis or material evidence that survives. Now, some of the Orientalists, their pushback, especially by those such as Professor Corona and Michael Crook, they initially thought that the Quran was written down way after the Prophet. So they thought that it was written down almost 200 years after the Prophet passes away. But now with these new manuscripts that we've found, and I'll show it on the next page, but with these new manuscripts, we can show that they actually date back right to either the time of the Prophet himself or very shortly after. And so that again, that kind of changes the whole narrative of when the Quran itself was written down. And a quick point also is that goes to show the reliability of the Hadith transmission system, because the Hadith transmission system clearly depicts the standardization process very early on. So the fact that we have these early manuscripts again goes to corroborate the Hadith system as a whole. So what are those manuscripts? We have three in particular that come from the first century. And so the first one includes the Birmingham manuscript, which was radiocarbon dated to the mid 7th century, which has a high potential of being within the lifetime of the Prophet himself. So that's very early on. We have a second manuscript known as the Sana manuscript. And so the Sana manuscript is interesting because we have a palimpsest, which is kind of like, so when you're working with a manuscript, you have what's known as the actual parchment. And then let's say you erased something on that parchment, you can actually use certain techniques in radiocarbon dating, and you can try to reconstruct what was erased or what was the original thing that was erased, right? And so that forms kind of two layers. The top layer is what obviously is preserved, but the bottom layer, which is known as the palimpsest, that includes the original wordings that were once erased. And so that's very interesting, as we'll show later on, because a lot of work has been done on the Sana manuscript. And again, it goes to show where you find variants in the Sana manuscript, they somehow correspond exactly with what the Hadith records attribute about them. This is something that we'll take a look in more detail later on. And then a third manuscript we have is the Topkapi manuscript. It's in the early part of Islam, first century, and it shows the conclusion of the standardization process. And an important point here is that all three manuscripts, they are very consistent with each other, and they also match with the kind of the Quran that we have today, almost word for word in every single spot. Now, continuing with this concept of the Uthmanic recension, so the fact that later records in the Hadith or literature match the early material evidence or like the Quranic codices, again, it's strong validation of the reliability of the Hadith system as a whole. In our case, the Hadith-based narrative of Uthman's recension is confirmed by actual physical Qur'ans from the first century, and that demonstrates that the Hadith transmitters successfully conveyed a true historical memory from the 7th century. So again, this kind of gives confidence that Hadiths were indeed, like they can serve as reliable historical basis And so while this is only one particular event and this doesn't prove the entire hadith corpus, it does set a precedent, which is that where hadith make claims that we could test objectively, they actually do prove to be accurate. Once again, this kind of lays a foundation for trusting these when it comes to other matters beyond just the Quran. Now, so like I said, there are certain variations that the companions were reading when it comes to the Quran. So just for some context, the Islamic tradition holds that the Quran was revealed in seven modes of recitation, also known as ahruf, and each of them have a slight variation in terms of pronunciation or in terms of wording. And so during the Prophet's lifetime, multiple different companions learned the Quran in different ways because the Prophet revealed them in different ways. And so this meant that there were a number of variations that the companions were reading. And as you can tell, that could end up becoming confusing for later Muslims, which is why Uthman, what he did was he burnt all the other copies and he authorized one version, the standardized version, which he sends out to different regions and he instructs everyone else to burn their own personal mushafs. Now, many senior companions kept their own private notebooks and codices of the Quran, and those codices themselves, they have variant readings. So, for example, the tradition attributes these privately kept mushafs. One of them is attributed to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and the other one is attributed to Ubay ibn Ka'b. And both of these were like very close companions to the Prophet himself. And the differences in these manuscripts, they are mentioned in our historical hadith reports. And so what they say, for example, is something like in the reading of Ibn Mas'ud, verse X has a word, extra word Y, for example. And so such reports were transmitted through the Isnad system like any other hadith were transmitted, and they represent an independent oral as well as written stream of transmission alongside the main canonical text. So once again, they show that the hadith, they attribute certain variants to specific companions. And what we can do now is we can look at the tangible evidence of the first century manuscripts that we have, and we can compare them with the hadith. And we can see that these manuscripts are lining up almost exactly the way that the hadith have mentioned them, which again shows because we never had the manuscripts of the Quran until much later on. They were discovered very recently. Despite that, the hadith served to be reliable. Like they were like accurate checkpoints, really. The manuscript evidence shows that there is this consistency, right? Specifically regarding the Sana palimpsest that I mentioned earlier on, where you had these two layers in the manuscript, where the upper layer represents the modified version and the lower layer, which is known as the palimpsest, represents the erased layer. So we have two particular scholars. Their names are Professor Sedki and as well as Arzi. And so they've analyzed the solemn palimpsest in detail, and they've identified about 60 instances where the erased lower text of that manuscript aligns with variant readings ascribed to the companions in the classical literature. They also researched subsequent surveys of other manuscripts and found an additional 20 kind of correspondences. And so in total, there's about 80 cases which have been documented where a known non-Uthmanic phrasing, which is mentioned like in the hadith in historical records, they match word for word with what the Qur'anic manuscript displays in terms of that fragment. So once again, the implication of this is that these like 80 matching cases serve as checkpoints that verify the content of our hadith corpus. And so that shows that these hadith truly do date back to the first generation of Islam. The later records match the early material evidence pretty much. And so it's highly unlikely that ninth century scholars who come almost like 200 or 300 years after the Prophet, it's unlikely that they could have simply guessed these variants and then archaeology happens to confirm them later on. Rather, the simplest explanation really is that the hadith narrators they faithfully transmitted what was actually recited by the Prophet's companions. This stands as one of the strongest proofs for the overall reliability of hadith, as it demonstrates the consistency of transmission across a gap of centuries in kind of an empirically verifiable way. Now, there are a number of kind of contentions that some of the Orientalists have brought up, and we will take some time here and just go through some of those contentions and why those contentions are wrong. The first of which is that the Quran was memorized in a different way than the Hadith, right? And so, yeah, the argument here is that there are some variants that were part of the Quranic preservation, and that these variants were actually written down. And so, this doesn't prove anything about Hadith transmission because the Hadith, according to these individuals, is that the Hadith were memorized, whereas the Quran was written down. But the issue with this is that after the Uthmanic recension, those particular phrases were no longer recited orally. And in terms of being written down, Uthman commanded that every single sheet or copy either be erased or completely burnt. And so this meant that knowledge of the non-standard phrases had to be preserved in some way, and that way ended up becoming oral. So essentially, those variations were transmitted the same exact way the hadith were transmitted, primarily because they were transmitted through an oral tradition. Now, what that goes to show is that kind of the successful preservation of those readings from the companions era to later hadith collectors, that, like, I think significantly demonstrates the efficiency of the Isnad system when it comes to transmitting detail across those particular generations. And so, if those early Quranic details could be reliably conveyed, it stands to reason that so could the prophetic hadiths that were transmitted with the same amount of rigor. Now, a second contention is that the readings were written down, whereas the hadith were not. And so the issue with this is that, as I said before, Sheikh Azmi has extensively documented and identified over 50 companions, as well as early kind of successors, who compiled these written hadith in the 7th century, as well as some within the first 100 years of the Islamic century. And what this shows is that hadith were also being written down. It's not necessarily oral the way that the Orientalists are claiming. And so, even for the Quranic readings, the written record was pretty largely eliminated because those records were either erased or burnt, as I said before. But yeah, the point is that they were actually both written down. So it is very similar in that sense. Now, a third contention is that hadiths are much longer and harder to transmit than short Quranic phrases. Now, the issue with this is that this kind of overlooks how this whole memorization process even works. So, memorizing a meaningful narrative, even if it's not verbatim, is actually a lot easier than remembering an isolated variant word. So a person who recalls the gist of a story and kind of later relates it in his own words, which still preserves the core information, is actually a lot more easy than narrating or memorizing not just the but a specific variation of that word. One has to recall exactly how it was without any altercations, which is again a significantly harder task. Now, Hadith scholars, they often allowed narrators to transmit by meaning, so as long as the core message was preserved. So, therefore, the kind of preservation of many precise Quranic variants goes to show that it's a lot more intense than just getting the gist of a speech, for example. So, people who could accurately remember whether a verse said, for example, حتى يتطهرون versus حتى يتطهران, or some other variant, that would be significantly more challenging than simply reciting a gist of an event. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Now, in terms of archaeology, what we find is that the archaeological record, it's very contemporaneous with the written sources from the 7th century, and it provides external confirmation of events and practices which are described within the hadith. The reasoning here is actually quite straightforward. If later Muslim narratives, such as the hadith, accurately describe something, and let's say we find material evidence or non-Muslim accounts from that era that corroborate those reports, then it stands to reason that those reports are reliable. And there are actually a number of these inscriptions that are found in Islamic sources as well as non-Islamic sources that corroborate the hadith reports. So I have here two particular examples. And the next slide, I have a couple more. So the first of which, it's called the Doctrona Lacobi, and this is actually a non-Muslim source. It's a Byzantine Greek text, which is written only a few years after the Prophet's death. and it contains an early reference to Islam. And so what it says, it describes kind of rumors about the Prophet Muhammad, and it says verbatim, it says, the Arabian prophet who has appeared with the Sacrians after a battle victory, proclaiming the coming of the messianic figure. So what this goes to show is that it confirms, like even though it's biased against Muslims, it confirms the existence of Muhammad himself, and it also mentions some key details about the keys of paradise, which is also found in the Hadith as well. And so it goes on to elaborate on the description of the armies and the description of the Prophet and what he came to say and what he came to do. And once again, that corroborates these Hadith statements as well about the Prophet. Now, we have another inscription where it names Muhammad and it calls him a merchant. And it says that he taught monotheism and he forbade a number of things, including wine and adultery. And so, once again, that corroborates with what we find in the Hadith corpus as well. Now, it also mentions, interesting, it says, love only for the God of Abraham. It's also found in this document. And it goes to show the corroboration found, like that particular statement was also corroborated in the Hadith narrations as well. So, what we find is essentially four major points of similarity. The first of which is that Prophet Muhammad's identity as a merchant and a descendant of the Prophet. And second, his preaching of strict monotheism, which is again in line with Abrahamic tradition. And third, the institution of certain Islamic laws. So, for example, like dietary restrictions, ban on fornication, as well as alcohol. And a fourth thing there's corroboration in is the concept of Muslims seeing themselves as the heirs to Abraham's covenant, which in Islamic terms relates to the prophesied Jerusalem, the promised land. And once again, all of these are found within the Hadith corpus. And so, although they come from non-Muslim sources, they overlap with what the Hadith are saying. Now, on top of that, there are a number of other inscriptions, but a key one is the inscription found about Zuhair. And what it shows is that we have a rock that has the inscription of Zuhair, and he says, I, Zuhair, wrote this at the time of Umar, died in the year 4 and 20. And it confirms the exact date of Umar's death as found in the Hadith reports themselves. There's also some stuff like Bismillah, it's written on the rock. And once again, it's authentically dated back to Imam Zuhair's time, but it's consistent with what we find in the Hadith. Now, I'm going to skip over some of the other inscriptions, but there are a number of inscriptions and they go over exactly the way the Hadith record those historical events. Now, there are a number of contentions with regards to the archaeological evidence that are said by the Orientalists. And the first claim is that there are no archaeological evidence of pagan idols in the 7th century Mecca, meaning that the Islamic accounts were fabricated. Now, what the argument is trying to show is that among the early Arabic inscriptions that we have found, no one or not one of them explicitly mentioned the pagan gods of Quraysh, which include Lat and Uzza, and some inscriptions even mention Allah alone. And so they argue that if Meccans were idolaters, as the Hadith narratives as they show, then we should find inscriptions attesting to that. And the absence of such evidence suggests that Muslim historians possibly exaggerated or even invented the idolatry of the Quraysh. Now, this line of reasoning essentially is saying that it's basically asking us, show us a 6th or 7th century inscription saying we worship Uzza. But the issue with this kind of line of reasoning is that it commits to the fallacy of expecting evidence where circumstances actually made in its preservation unlikely. So, in essence, what we're saying is that it's a case of absence of evidence is evidence of absence. The absence of evidence is evidence of absence. And so, what I mean by that is that inscriptions in general are very rare. We can barely find them. And because of that, it makes no sense to warrant that because we lack a specific inscription, that the entire narrative is wrong. And there is a general absence of inscriptions from that specific time frame. And because there's that lack of those inscriptions, we can't use that as a basis to reject a specific inscription. I hope that kind of makes sense. So just because we don't find an inscription where we don't expect to find an inscription, that doesn't prove that there are no inscriptions of that nature. And also, just because certain inscriptions contain the word Allah, they don't eliminate polytheism. Because even as the Quran and the Hadith kind of mention, the pagans were not just ascribing the Quran, the words of Allah, but they actually believed that God was Allah. And despite that, they believed in other gods besides Allah. They actually believed that Allah was the most high God and that there were other gods besides Allah. And so just because inscriptions have this unique phrase, they say in the name of Allah, for example, that doesn't exclude them from being polytheistic in nature. Now, there are two other contentions that they've gone over. The lack of inscriptions is really the point here, right? And so the Hadith provide an explanation for it. One of the explanations for why there's not that much inscription is because the literacy rates in Mecca and Medina were very low. So in some narrations, it mentions that there are only 17 people in Mecca who could read and write. So it stands to reason if there are very few people with literary skills, then they wouldn't be able to write their names or write inscriptions on rocks and stuff like that. It's not really plausible. So again, we don't expect to see this kind of evidence even to begin with. Therefore, we don't expect that just because something doesn't exist in the records, that therefore it doesn't exist at all. And then there's also an interesting point about the confirmation of polytheism, where kind of pagan names like Uzza, they kind of demonstrate idol worship. So, for example, Abu Lahab's real name was like Abu Lahab in of itself is telling of kind of the God he worshipped, right? And so the hadith records show that these naming practices changed post conversion. And that really doesn't make sense. Why would they be changing their names if they weren't worshiping these gods? It stands to reason that their conversion to monotheism inspired them to change their names. And this matches what archaeology does show, right? It shows inscriptions of the name Abdul Uzza, for example. So once again, like why would someone change their name from Abdul Uzza to Abdullah, for example, right? That goes to show this clear conversion from polytheism to theism. Now, like I mentioned earlier, we have this special instance of the solar eclipse. And what this shows is that there's a somewhat of a new and innovative way to test the reliability of hadith. And again, this is something that we can only do with modern day technology, right? We can compare hadith reports containing astronomical events. We can compare that with the data we receive from NASA. And so the hadith mention two particular instances where a solar eclipse occurred, right? So one of which was at the death of Ibrahim, who was the Prophet's son. And so the hadith verbatim, it says, the eclipse on the day the Prophet's son Ibrahim died. People thought it was due to his death. The Prophet corrected them. And what that shows is that during the Prophet's son Ibrahim, when he passed away, there was a kind of local nationwide eclipse, and multiple people had reported that event. And they thought that this was due to the death of the child itself, but the Prophet corrected him and said that this has nothing to do with the death of my child, but it has to do with one of the signs of Allah. And that puts his son passed away at 18 months. That puts this event somewhere in between 30 to 632 CE. Now, the astonishing thing here is that the NASA database records a solar eclipse that's visible from Medina in January 27th, 32 CE. And that perfectly fits with the timeline as mentioned in the Hadith. Now, there's another celestial event that happened during Ummah's assassination, and it's reported that when he was stabbed, he died 26th Dhul Hijjah, which corresponds to the November 644 CE. Now, again, with this event, there's multiple eyewitnesses that attest to that event. And once again, we have NASA with their database. It shows that a solar eclipse was in fact visible on November 5th. Interesting thing here is that we even have the exact date of the month. So not just the year, but the exact date of the month, which is November 5th. And again, that's astonishing how reliable the hadith is preserved. It doesn't only get the year, but even gets the exact day and the exact month of the solar eclipse. So again, the implication of all of this is that the hadith could be verified, and wherever it's being verified with tangible evidence, time and time again, it keeps being preserved. It's never a case where the hadith is being falsified with these tangible evidences. It's always the opposite. Whenever we do test the hadith with tangible evidence, the hadith always comes out on top. It always shows itself to be right. So once again, that goes to show that if hadith were really just transmitted through oral traditions and fabricated much later on, how is it possible for someone 200, 300 years after these events to reliably be tracing these events back and even getting the exact month and date right when it comes to modern day technology? It's just implausible to suggest that these were fabricated. Now, we'll be going over the reliability of the oral tradition. So, as I said already, the hadith that survived and that were written down by later compilers of hadith, we've already shown that it's not merely oral tradition. It was also written down in terms of mushafs and stuff. Now, even if we do accept that it's predominantly oral tradition, that actually goes in our favor as well, because the common criticism is that the oral tradition is unreliable and that hadith is like a telephone game. But why that comparison fails is because when it comes to the telephone game, participants deliberately only hear a message once and they can't really ask for clarification. And they usually twist the message really just for fun. But when it comes to the hadith transmission system, that's not the case at all. Key material was transmitted through frequent repetition and rigorous memorization techniques. And an example here is that multiple poems and large amounts of documents were actually being memorized, and that's very common with societies that are not literate. So there's a number of research studies that go over this connection where the more you have societies that are not literate, the more you see mass memorization of large events, of large documents, of large poems, and their rates of memorizing is actually very high. And so these people were like experts. If you come from a non-literate society, you end up having better techniques of memorizing certain things than, let's say, a society that is literate or that doesn't rely on memorization. So once again, it's not necessarily the case that it's similar to the telephone game, because in regards to the actual hadith narratives or hadith transmission systems, the teacher and student relationship is one which the teacher continuously repeats the saying and the student is repeatedly memorizing it. It's not simply the case where he hears it once and then passes it on. Now, when it comes to specific incidences, right? Pre-Islamic poetry, as an example, the Arabic tradition of oral poetry is really perhaps the strongest evidence of the reliability of the memory culture that existed in Arabia. So, for centuries, even before Islam was in Arabia, they composed what's known as long odes, and that was all transmitted orally across generations. So those poems often contain hundreds of lines of complex and end rhyming verses with constant meters and stuff. And anyone who studies poetry can attest to how complicated this entire process was. And so they were eventually written down in the Islamic period. But what this shows is that once again, the Arabs had a culture of kind of mass memorizing these very complicated poems that spanned hundreds of lines of really just poetry. And so once again, that shows that these Arabs were masters when it comes to memorization. Now, there are a couple of other notions in this regard, and there's a few more examples of this kind of memorizing of other texts and stuff. But for the sake of brevity, we'll go ahead and skip this part. Now, really, we can't discuss preservation without discussing the issue of hadith fabrication. Like within Islamic scholarship, the idea isn't that hadith were not being forged. It's quite the opposite. Hadith were being forged to a mass level. And the role of the classical Muslim scholars was to manage this mass forgery and pinpoint exactly where the forgeries were happening. So it's not as if we're saying that forgeries don't happen. It's that we've developed a robust method to pinpoint these forgeries and grade the hadith. When one examines the nature of these reports and the operations of the Isnad method, it really becomes clear that the growth in the Hadith literature reflects the spread of authentic reports through multiple chains and not wholesale fabrication of content. So if we actually reflect on this point, we see that there are these massive numbers of hadith, right? And it's true that by the third Islamic century, hadith compilers like Imam Ahmad and Muslim, they catalog tens of thousands of narrations. So for example, Bukhari is said to have examined 600,000 narrations and included only 700, some of them with repetition. And so to a lay observer, this might imply that there were 500,000 distinct sayings floating around. Most of them were quite spurious. But again, this is a big misunderstanding, right? So the massive number of these hadith, those are coming from the number of chains, right? Not from the actual text of the chain. That's why the number is so high. So hadith scholars count each chain variant as a separate hadith altogether when it comes to the actual like narration count. If the Prophet's statement is transmitted by 10 different companions, and each of those lines branches out to 10 students, one ends up with 100 isnads transmitting one text or matan, which is often logged as if it was 100 hadith, like 100 separate hadith. As one of the Orientalist researchers explained, he says the phenomenal growth of tradition in the second and third centuries was not primarily growth of content, but largely the progressive increase in multiple chains of transmission. So in other words, the community wasn't like creating 600,000 new sayings. They were generating multiple attestations for a fixed body of sayings. Now, another thing is that mathematical models back this up, right? So, if even a few hundred companions taught a few students the number of transmission chains, what that does is that explodes the number of hadith, again, not because of the number of texts, but because of the number of chains. Mathematically, we can actually see this and it makes sense. Assuming one companion narrates a hadith to 10 students, in the next generation, each of those 10 transmits it to 10 more, and so on. By the third generation, you have thousands of chains of the same hadith. Now you can just multiply that and you can see that a number like 600,000 is actually very easy to get. The numbers in hadith collections are actually what we expect if authentic sayings were really, if they actually disseminated widely. Something like, I think his name was Joseph Scott, but he considered the spread of common links as evidence for fabrication. But again, this isn't evidence for fabrication because it just goes to show, as Harold Motsky did, he shows that these vast numbers actually makes sense if one was transmitting them in each generation to their students and that each student was generating them to the next student. It makes sense why these numbers are so high. And once again, it's not the actual text of the that's high, but it's the number of that are high. Now, another aspect here is that the isnad or the chain of narrators, it's not just a formalism. It was the mechanism by which scholars scrutinized authenticity at each step. So a hadith with a dubious or missing link would be flagged as weak because of that dubiousness within the link. So the very existence of multiple chains allowed scholars to cross-verify content. If 10 companions in different cities all reported essentially the same saying, it's much harder to consider it fabricated. The compilers like intentionally chose hadith that had strong corroborated chains. So while they heard 600,000 narrations, most of which were just repeats or variants, job was to distill them to the ones with the most reliable chains. So that's why he included only 7,000, and those 7,000 included, and so that really only boils down to a few thousand actual sayings of the Prophet. Now, the Orientalists caricature that these big numbers equal big fabrications, that really ignores the methodological rigor of hadith scholars. In fact, one of the Orientalist scholars, he acknowledges this and he says scripturally scrutinized hadith in each step of the transmission, implying again that these hadith scholars rigorously they rigorously assess these reports and that the huge growth in hadith reports represents largely the progressive like increase in multiple chains, not actual content. Now, also, if hadith were mostly fabricated in later times, we would expect to see signs of kind of that form of mass fabrication. So, for instance, many contradictory versions of events or hadith content that is anachronistic to the Prophet's era, or perhaps a more random distribution of isnads. But what we observe is actually the opposite. So the matan or the text of the hadith shows a great deal of consistency and coherence with 7th century Arabia, and the isnads show a converging genealogy rather than a chaotic one. What that shows is that a massive number of metans did not really exist. It was actually the fact that a relatively small core of sayings is repeated across thousands of chains is evidence that the community was preserving a finite body of teachings, not continually inventing new ones. And again, this aligns with what we might expect to find if hadith were genuinely transmitted from the Prophet to his companions. Each hadith spread and on many different routes, but remained essentially one narrative. And also another point to mention is that Orientalists often assume that because some hadith were fabricated, therefore all hadith are doubted unless proven otherwise. But this extreme skepticism essentially throws out the baby with the bathwater. The point here is that when it comes to throwing out the entire system of hadith, that's a very unjustified jump. In any historical source, one expects some inaccuracies, but the proper approach is to critically evaluate and corroborate, not to dismiss everything. Modern Western scholars are increasingly taking a more balanced view, which shows that you ought to examine each hadith or on its own merit. For example, using dating techniques or content analysis in comparison with other evidence. What we do when we do that, as we see done multiple times before, we actually find that a significant portion of the hadith corpus does hold up, so it does have weight to them. And the early Muslim kind of instances of isnad and their keen awareness of forgery, that suggests that the tradition self-corrected against large-scale fabrications. And the massive number of isnads is exactly what we would expect if authentic hadith were in fact being widely transmitted. It is not in of itself proof of forgery, but rather a feature of how genuine transmission works over a broad network. So, to really conclude this presentation, what we can see is that number one, we have the reliability of hadith, and that's supported by converging evidence from multiple independent sources. The early Qur'anic manuscripts confirmed specific hadith accounts, for example, Uthman's compilation and the companion readings, and inscriptions and contemporary non-Muslim writings corroborate events, names, and practices described in hadith. For example, the preaching of Muhammad down to details like the Hijri dates and the usage of Bismillah, as well as kind of astronomical data verified these chronological events that's claimed within the hadith corpus. It's verified to a very high degree of precision, right? Even going down to the very date and month. And again, the demonstrated capacity of Arabic oral tradition also goes to show how it's in line with the conceptual form of the way that hadith were transmitted. Now, it's also important to stress that no single argument proves every hadith to be authentic. Again, confirming 80 companion variant readings does not automatically authenticate specific legal hadith about travel, for example. However, each argument increases our confidence in the overall trustworthiness of the hadith corpus. And just to be clear here, what we're saying is that these independent reasons show that if hadith were in fact being fabricated, it's highly unlikely that these later fabricators would get these very specific things right, whether that be archaeological data or manuscript confirmations or astrological data, or for example, texts of non-Muslims that corroborate. That is seen as a very extremely powerful argument for the preservation of hadith. Now, many of the traditional Orientalist critiques of hadith have been answered by modern scholars within hadith scholarship currently. This slide really just goes to show how modern scholarship is way more nuanced than the scholarship that was once in the 19th century, and it recognizes hadith as valuable sources of historical information. All this goes to show the success of the system, which again shows that the system functioned data redundancy, where multiple independent chains preserve the same or similar text. What we can do is actually cross-check and evaluate the narrator to minimize these forgery events that were happening. And these are some of the takeaways that you can appreciate from this presentation.